When a building is no longer useful, it's usually demolished. When an object becomes lost, it's sometimes never seen again. There are exceptions to both of these rules. Some unwanted buildings are spared from destruction but remain standing, abandoned, and alone. Some of that which is lost can be found again. The stories of abandoned places and objects can be haunting but beautiful at the same time. Watch this video, and you'll see what we mean. Many of the abandoned wonders in Mexico were created by the Maya and the Aztecs, but Las Posas in the Zititla region is a little different. Rather than being the ruins of an ancient civilization, Las Posas is all the work of one eccentric, reclusive English poet. Edward James visited this part of Mexico in the 1940s and decided to literally build his home here. When he bought Las Posas in 1947, there was an old coffee plantation on the site, but James spent the next few years turning it into both a zoo and an exotic garden. 20 years later, a freakishly cold winter destroyed most of his plants. Rather than starting again by planting new ones, the poet made sculptures and statues, and then added bizarre architectural flourishes, including stairs that don't lead anywhere. Aside from his poetry, James wasn't big on communication. For that reason, nobody really knows why he did any of this. When he passed away in 1984, he took his secrets to the grave and left Las Posas to become overgrown. Most of the people who live close to it don't even know it's there, but you do. Petrovagora in Malacca, Croatia, is an example of what happens when important buildings aren't given proper protection. When it was built back in 1981 by Croatian architect Vojislav Bačić, it was a beautiful memorial for those who'd lost their lives in the Second World War. The scenic hillside location was chosen because under the hill is a network of tunnels and rooms that became makeshift field hospitals during the conflict, and eventually became a secret hideout for Yugoslavian communists. Today, Petrovagora is an ugly concrete skeleton. Every scrap of metal that was once attached to its frame has been stolen and used in building projects elsewhere. You might be wondering why the government didn't do anything about the repeated thefts. The answer is that while Bačić meant well with his memorial, he didn't get planning permission from anyone before he built it. The monument was technically illegal, and so it wasn't given any protection when scavengers started to show up. We can't help but feel that an exception could and should have been made for this once beautiful structure. Within the next century, we might see the first ever human colony built on Mars. If and when it happens, it might look more than a little like Germany's cosmic greenhouse. In fact, the resemblance between these structures and the Martian bases that appear in science fiction is so strong that the locals have nicknamed the place Mission to Mars. The history of this site, the location of which we're keeping secret on request from its current owner, is very unusual. There used to be a monastery on this site, but it was sold in 1987 and became a training center for gardeners. That's the way it stayed for almost 2 decades, but the training center closed down in 2005, and no other purpose has yet been found for the land and the unusual buildings on it. A small team of volunteers, many of whom are professional gardeners who did their training here, visit the site regularly to maintain it and stave off the worst effects of vandalism and decay. Maybe NASA could use it to train astronauts. There isn't much left of the old Kimberly-Clark paper mill plant in Everett, Washington, USA. It was built during the 1930s, but most of it was demolished in 2012. All that's left now is its digester building and an ominous-looking rusty acid accumulator. Quite why the demolition project was abandoned before it was finished is unknown, but technically the property still belongs to Kimberly-Clark. The company has held on to it even though the Port of Everett wants to buy it from them and use it for port purposes. Its waterfront location would be perfect for that. But at the moment, the land is still home to nothing but an eyesore. It's possible that there's a pollution issue at the site, which is preventing further demolition work and would complicate any sale, but Kimberly-Clark has never confirmed or denied that such an issue exists. However, they have been working with the Department of Ecology on pollution issues since 2013, so it's likely that there's at least some truth to that rumor. While the debate about the plant's future rolls on, the plant itself is slowly falling to pieces. If someone doesn't demolish it soon, it might fall down of its own accord. The Orient Express was once the pinnacle of luxury when it comes to train travel. Tickets for the service were unashamedly expensive, and every carriage was first class. Riding the Orient Express wasn't necessarily about the journey. It was about being seen. Many of the trains that once ran on the Orient Express line are now in museums, but this one isn't. Instead, the Type 620 train unit is rusting away in Belgium. The circumstances behind its abandonment here are unfortunate. The train was bought with the intention of it becoming the centerpiece of a new train museum, but the museum plan collapsed, and the train was left without a purpose. Nobody else came forward to take ownership of it, so it's simply been left to rot. Bearing that in mind, it's a little surprising that it hasn't been vandalized more than it has. The exterior of the train is badly damaged, offering little sense of how stunning it once looked. Peer through the windows, though, and you might be able to get a vague sense of what life on board would have been like for its well-heeled customers during the train's heyday. Staying in Belgium for a moment, this is the old crystal factory of Val Saint-Lambert. The history of this site goes back more than 800 years. An abbey was built here in 1202, going on to be demolished and rebuilt several times over the centuries before the building became a crystallary in 1826. By the end of the 19th century, the surrounding area contained nearly 200 houses built for the factory's workers, along with a school for their children and a hospital to take care of them. Over 120,000 crystal objects were made here every day, many of which were commission pieces ordered by Russian czars. Unfortunately, the factory was damaged by a bombing raid in the Second World War. Although production resumed after the war, it was never on the same scale, and most of the buildings have been abandoned since then. Crystal production continues even to this day in a few of the smaller buildings, but the larger ones are derelict. Still, the site remains popular with urban explorers, some of whom have even found forgotten crystal goods on their visits. The so-called Oculus Tower in Ferrara, Italy, was once the centerpiece of a distillery that was known across Italy for producing some of the country's finest alcoholic drinks. It belonged to Eridania, who produced alcohol for Martini and also used the facilities to make industrial oil for Manuti. However, it wasn't an overnight success. The factory opened in 1935 but struggled initially, almost closing after a bombing attack in the Second World War. It survived, though, and by 1953, it was producing 1/3 of all the alcohol in Italy. While the facilities might look antiquated, the factory was still producing alcohol at the start of the 21st century. The good times were over by then, though. It started to struggle against competition from abroad in the 1980s and finally collapsed in 2005. The buildings have been empty ever since then. If you didn't know what the factory was used for, you probably wouldn't be able to guess from looking at these pictures. The tower is such a grand building that you could almost believe it was once a cathedral. Sadly, it's been officially marked for demolition since 2016, but the work hasn't yet been carried out. In 1957, A rich entrepreneur in the Belgian city of Verviers started bottling and selling water from a well outside his villa. His spring water proved to be popular with the locals, so the entrepreneur built a factory so he could produce more of it. That factory is now known as Club Soda, and it was once one of the biggest spring water producers in Europe. During 1980, the company's best ever year, it produced and sold 18,000 bottles every single day. It would probably still be selling soda and spring water today were it not for a heavy snowstorm in 2011, which partially collapsed the roof. For reasons that haven't been made public, the company's insurance provider refused to pay out for the damage, and so the factory has remained closed ever since then. Aside from the roof damage, it still looks like it's ready for the workers to return. There are bottles lined up in boxes, and even soda ingredients still inside machines. Sadly, there's little point in reopening the factory now. The source of the spring water has since passed into a nearby river. It's always sad to see an abandoned theme or amusement park, and yet there's at least one in every country. Aquaria Park in Pinarella di Cervia, Italy, is a stunning example of such a place. It barely survived for more than a decade in business, opening in 1992 and shutting down again in 2004. The park was based on another water park called Aquafan in Riccione. That park's still open, but this one was never quite as popular. From these pictures, it looks like someone still comes along to cut the grass occasionally, but the rides have started to look a little shabby. The brightly colored slides are still in one piece, but the wooden pier has collapsed, and many of the metal staircases look twisted and dangerous. That hasn't put urban explorers off the idea of climbing up them and going down the slides to take pictures, but we wouldn't recommend taking such risks to any of our viewers. Nobody knows what will eventually be done with the park and its rides, but while it's still standing, it would be a good place to film an apocalyptic horror movie. The half-sunken church of St. Nicholas in Mavrovo Lake, Macedonia, is hailed by its admirers as a triumph of religion over bureaucracy. The beautiful church was built in the small village of Mavrovo in 1850. It played a vital role in the lives of the local community for more than 150 years. But in 1953, the Macedonian government decided that this would be the perfect place to create an artificial lake. The fact that the church would be drowned didn't bother them. In recent years, though, the church has made a reappearance. Water levels in the lake have dropped due to the changing climate in the region, and at least part of the church is visible all year round. Locals say it's a sign that God disapproves of the lake. It's probably more of a sign that someone ought to do something about water storage in Macedonia, but we can see why it would be interpreted another way. The church has almost certainly been badly damaged internally after years in the water, but externally it's in surprisingly good condition. Perhaps there's been a miracle here after all. For almost all of its existence, Aniva Rock was uninhabited. It's a small, insignificant piece of land off the south coast of Sakhalin, not far from where the Sea of Okhotsk meets the Sea of Japan. Neither Japan nor Russia showed any interest in Aniva Rock until the 19th century, when both of them suddenly decided they want to claim it at the same time. That led to a protracted disagreement that eventually ended with the countries agreeing to take half of the island each. Aniva Lighthouse was built on the Japanese side of the island in 1939. They didn't get to enjoy it for long. The Russians kicked them off the island during the Second World War, and then took permanent ownership of it when the Treaty of San Francisco was signed in 1951. In the 1990s, the lighthouse started to run on nuclear batteries, one of only a handful of its kind in the whole world. Today it's abandoned, but much of its equipment is still inside. The lighthouse keeper's logbook is even still open on one of the tables. Halmer Gyu used to be considered a sacred place by the Nanette people of the Komi Republic in Russia. It was where they came to bury their dead. Today, it's a ghost town full of abandoned industrial buildings and apartments, the remains of a brief coal mining boom many decades ago. Rich coal deposits were found in this remote location by geologists in 1942, after which around 200 people moved and built houses to kickstart the mining process. The capital mine was built in 1951 and reached full production with 3 deep mining pits in 1957. At its peak, the town was home to around 8,000 people. They built schools, hospitals, bakeries, and even a live music venue. Unfortunately for the residents, the coal reserves began to dry up in the 1980s. The mine was deemed unprofitable in 1993 and was liquidated in 1996. The residents moved away, mostly to Vorkuta, and their former homes were left to the mercy of the snow and ice. Today, they're half buried in it. The site was briefly used as a military training ground during the early 21st century, which damaged many of the remaining buildings. But aside from that, it's been empty ever since. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching and see you soon!